Hi, I'm Shannon Hopkins from Rooted Good, and I'm here today with my colleague from Rooted Good, Mark Elsdon. Our theme this season is church property, imagining good futures. We are hosting this season because we believe that right now the church in America is in the midst of a great transition. Churches' economic models are changing, and the way they think about and use their property and land is up for grabs. And as churches engage with their building and land use, it is providing rich, robust, compelling, transformative work in communities across America. And we want to highlight that. This season, we are introducing you to the pastors and leaders that are stepping out in new ways and showing us what the church of the future could look like. Their stories are phenomenal, and their work is helping to lay a path into a new and good future for the church and the world.
This week, we want to highlight the outsized impact a small church can have in its community. We have two guests with us today, Brenda Halverson and Reverend Staci Maurice-Wheeler. Brenda is a lay leader at Common Grace, where Staci is the pastor. Common Grace has a story we believe is going to become more and more common. It is the story of two churches merging, and by selling one property, imagining something new together on the other property. There's a lot of different threads to their story that we're going to draw upon and unpack in this conversation with them. So what struck you, Shannon, about this conversation that we had?
Well, I think there are two things that really stand out to me. One is about really their relationship with their neighbors, and this really flipping the script from everything coming to being the church led to being really about in relationship and really their neighborhood and their neighbors. And Staci used this quote, like, maybe the neighbors can save us, and I really love that. And the other thing was when Brenda talked about, really what it looked like to leave the church and why she's on this journey, and her vulnerability and commitment to this process. I mean, it was just amazing. I wish we weren't online and I could have really given her a hug at the end. So, yeah. What about you though? I mean, it comes out in this episode that you're really working with them closely because they're in Madison. But yeah, what for you today stood out?
Yeah, this one's really fun for me because, for sort of full disclosure to our listeners, I am actually working for this church with a development partner to help them develop this property. So I know quite a bit about it. And it's really fun, though, to hear their reflections on it, kind of stepping back and looking at it. I think simply the amount of remarkable work they're doing for a small church. I mean, two small churches merging into one that's still quite small. And the reflection on what all it takes. I mean, the level of sort of persistence and kind of pressing onness that is required to do this sort of work, but that has led them to the point where they're actually looking at breaking ground in the summer on a new development project that will completely transform their property for the future. It's pretty.
Brenda, welcome. It's so good to have you here today.
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you.
And Staci, nice to have you with us. We're so delighted.
Thanks, Shannon. It's good to be here.
As you know, in this podcast, we're talking about this moment in the life of the church that is changing, and specifically about the opportunity and challenges that the church is facing as it relates to building and land use. I know that you both, Brenda and Staci, are in the midst of a big development project, and we're going to get to that. But can you start by telling us a bit about Common Grace? Where are you located, and what led you to do the work you're doing right now?
We're in Madison, Wisconsin, which is south central Wisconsin. And we are two congregations in a federated church model. So we are an ELCA congregation and a Moravian congregation that came together both in full communion agreement, so that we could do this federated model in a way that honored our connectional relationships with both denominations, didn't have to merge and choose one or the other, but shared the identity of the congregations that have been on the east side of Madison for decades, and met to do our good work together.
That's amazing. So really you were two separate congregations, and you still are, but you've kind of come together in one new identity.
Yes, we are to the public. We are Common Grace. It's a unified church, so we have common worship, we have a common board, we have a common budget. It's all together, but we are still maintaining our denominational identities, and but everything else is Common Grace. We are a unified witness.
And what led you to do this? And I mean, what's the situation with your properties as a result?
So what led us to do that is prior to becoming Common Grace, both congregations realized that we could do more in the community if we were banded together. Smaller congregations, lack of resources. So that's really why we came together to form Common Grace. And it's always been the mission upon doing that is to find something that was outside of the church. As Mark writes about, church of today can't be the same as church of yesterday. So we needed to get outside of our walls to find something that had purpose for us as a congregation, but also served our neighbors. We just didn't want to be insular and having everything be focused on us as a congregation. So we started to look at options for the property. It's an interesting setup. It's on a triangle. And so, we just started talking with the alder for the neighborhood and asked him, what are the needs in the neighborhood? What can we do to help with that? And one of those items was housing. So that kind of sent us down the path of looking at not only creating a community center building, which Common Grace will be a part of, but creating housing that would help workforce level neighbors in our community to have affordable housing.
And Brenda, you are part of what you all have been calling the historic Zion Lutheran Church. So I found it interesting that over the years that I've picked up, you kind of refer to your historic, respective two churches in that terminology. And Staci, I guess, was pastor of the historic Moravian Church. So we got kind of both of you here. But what happened to your building, Brenda?
So I must be enjoy being punished for something, because I was involved with selling the Zion property. So my husband and I both were involved in working with a developer in that particular area to sell the property and put up apartment rental units at market rate on the property. So when we sold that was probably 4 years ago. We knew we were going to be combining forces, so to speak, with Lakeview Moravian. And so we brought those proceeds from the sale of the Zion property to the relationship, and we're using those funds as kind of a big chunk of the down payment. So that's right now, and the building is going up.
I think one of the things that's interesting, I of course am connected to this project in multiple directions, so I know a little bit more about it than some of the other guests we've had on this podcast. But that particular way that unfolded is fascinating, in that the historic Zion property is going to be the greenest multifamily building ever built in Madison. And it is actually also primarily financed with Islamic impact investment money on a formerly Christian church site. So sort of this really interesting confluence of things happening there. And then the funds of which are going to help with the development of the new facilities on the Common Grace site.
Mm-hmm.
And that all together is sort of this really interesting indication, I think, of the sorts of creative things that we're all trying to do as churches and as church people. in the United States.
Yep. Um, I'm wondering, Mark, if you can talk more about also the interesting reason that that's Islamic equity. It's equity backed money, right? And not interest bearing, right? And how
That's correct.
I just think for our listeners, for them to understand, I think it is creating interesting new forms of capital into this space.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of getting too finance oriented here, we'll keep it short. But yes, it is interesting that one of the challenges that all these projects face that we've been observing is financing them. How do you fund and finance them? And a solution that the developer who acquired the Zion project came up with was to seek equity investment from Islamic investors who are really interested in community development, but they don't do interest bearing loans. So they do equity investment instead as a result of their faith tradition. And so that's what's happening there. Yeah.
So I wonder if we go back to the site that you're on now, Brenda and Staci, and the development that's going to happen there with housing, with a community center. I wonder if you can talk about the ministry and mission of the church. On your website, you talk a lot about really being a part of the daily lives of people in the neighborhood. And I wonder how the way you're imagining this project, how that's going to help you do that work better, more fully.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a primary focus, and that has been for actually quite a long time. So, at least for the last decade, um, multiple East Side Madison churches have been working together for greater community impact, right? How do we use our properties and our assets better to serve the community? And one of the very first things that I mean, it basically started as a kind of a clearinghouse of community needs. Whoever hears of something that needs sort of a human resource workforce or some help with funding, or has some needs that would take a sort of a critical mass of people and funds, how can we be part of that to pursue doing good in our community in a way that is much more hands-on and not so siloed in our own sort of limited scopes of that. So that was an church collaboration that we called Seeds of Peace that started in 2015, basically, and Episcopal, United Methodist, ELCA, Lutherans, Moravians, United Church of Christ. It was a kind of a nice swath of mainline Protestant denominations. And one of the first things that we did was help the school that sits across the street from Lakeview Moravian, now Common Grace, help the school with a passport fair in 2016. And that basically was a way to respond to a lot of anxiety for kids and families in this Spanish immersion school of the Madison public school system that were needing to do some formal, paperwork, create passports or apply for passports for children, do some legal work for parental declaration of authority in case deportation happened. So it was a really intense piece that drew us together and put us immediately into a different kind of relationship with the schools that made room for us to do that there on their property when they had a professional development day, with lots of community volunteers and lots of church volunteers, a GoFundMe to raise money for passports. And I think that just sort of was the catalyst for, boy, we can be super effective together, and we can work with the community in ways that get things done in a different way if we just sort of get out of our own four walls, right? And get off of our own properties. So that, I mean, each of the churches had lots and lots of people meeting in their buildings on a regular basis, right? And each of our buildings was still underutilized. Each of our properties was still underutilized. So that led to lots of interesting, very generative conversations between clergy and lay people in that group as we met and looked forward to it. So in 2020, actually right before the pandemic shutdown, three smallest congregations of that 8-church consortium started talking about a common campus, or how do we use our properties better. And Zion Lutheran and Lakeview Moravian had both been talking about that individually already. So that was kind of the impetus, but we had seen it work, right? By that time, we had seen it work for several years in the community, and we just knew that model was going to be effective. So yeah, we hope that none of our buildings were extraordinarily space effective. None of our buildings were extraordinarily accessible. And so we hope a new building will just take that to the next level. Even rebranding our building as a community center, as the nonprofit we formed, that has opened up accessibility incredibly.
So that's a really interesting move, because I think, let me just test this. What I think you're describing is, rather than kind of this model where the church has its building and invites partners in, which is very common, of course, churches have done that for a long time, you're kind of flipping it on its head, and you're actually rebranding and the building is actually becoming a community center, and the church is like a core user of the community center. And it's subtle, but really critical shift. Yes? Is that correct?
So just so it's the doing business as model, I think, might be a way to think of it for folks, right? So Common Grace is two congregations that are still congregations in their own right, doing business as Common Grace, right? And so the community center is the church property, but we are doing business as the Eastmoreland Community Center, which means that we honor the partnerships we have with building partners. We have kind of followed a leading, God's leading into this I think it's a mission of helping small businesses, small nonprofits incubate in our local neighborhood. Two are women run, two are one is a fair trade retail ministry, nonprofit ministry that is run to support anti-trafficking and worker justice. So, we're kind of bringing in building partners that are tenants with us, as well as all sorts of community groups that use the space. But it does, as Mark said, it flips it, right? Because we're constantly having to look at space that we are sharing now. We have a small physical plant, and so now it's about, if we're about accessibility and we are here about relationship, then, and we say we're about partnership, how do we do that in equitable ways, instead of always saying, well, this has to be here, this has to be here. So sometimes that means we cover our cross, and we don't call our sanctuary a sanctuary anymore. On our reservation list, we call it a gathering, the large gathering space. And that doesn't mean that we're divorcing ourselves from that symbol or that language, but it does mean that we recognize that sometimes those are barriers, those words and those symbols are barriers to the community feeling a real welcome or acceptance.
But the church is still going to own it.
Yeah. Brenda, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Yes, we are. So it's been a long process, but we are in almost to the finish line of creating an LLC, which will own the property, because we're having housing and the community center, right? We'll have a lot of different people coming through the property. We formed the LLC to obviously limit the liability for those entities, but that will be vital in terms of how we go about getting additional financing. But yes, we will still own the property. It will just be branded Eastmoreland Community Center.
Yeah, so the church owns it. The community center will be the public-facing sort of doorway in, and the church will meet in it. So it's this like multi-layered thing going on, right? Which is, I just think is really interesting, because it's kind of, you're really leaning into the church's ministry as church, but also really leaning into the community-oriented ministry with the community center. kind of both. Yeah.
And the church will have programming, right, to a limited degree, primarily just serving the two schools that are adjacent to our property. So we have a couple different programs, weekend food programs that we use to serve those children across the street. So we still have, right, our missions and our ministries that we're going to do. No, it's Eastmoreland Community Center. Am I being corrected? But we started it, right?
Well,
Okay, all right.
it is
I'm like-
confusing. It is confusing because basically we're very small congregations, right? And so basically we have taken our outward, like those community mission pieces, which exactly as Brenda described, right, are about the school, working with the schools next door, and some food programs we've created with them, and we've broadened them. And so now, we took a book study that we had regularly, and we call it Eastmoreland. We called it Eastmoreland Reads. It was a book about Indigenous equity. It was a book about community, but it wasn't just Common Grace members, right? It was the fuller the wider community that came in. Brenda started a knitting group for the congregation. That knitting group went from just being Zion to being Common Grace, and now we have neighbors that come to that knitting group too. And I think the important thing about that, you talked about we are talking about the rebranding. The important thing about that is to always keep in mind that we're not, as a colleague of mine used to call it, we're not baiting and switching on people, right? We are not saying, oh, come in, come in, come in, come in. We want you to be part of our congregation. We are saying, come in, come in, come in, come in. There's a congregation that lives here. This is what we're about. If you're asking questions, if you want to know, you're, privy to seeing how we function. And, we meet on Sunday morning. So everybody's welcome. And it's amazing to me, in 15 years on this site as a pastor, I have seen more visitors through the door in the last 4 years. We had no children under 10 when we came together in 2021, and now there are eight that are 8 years old and down, right? So that's an interesting piece, and they're all walkers, right? They're walkers or people who live. It's kind of hyper local, so that feels like a very different way, and they're not all Christian. That's another interesting thing to me, is right. I mean, there are people who say, "Yeah, I'm not really Christian, but this worshiping community feels like something I need." So that to me is extraordinarily compelling about how God is working in ways that folks did not feel accessibility before, and I'm not sure what's happening there, but that's exciting. And I would say Brenda is not a glutton for punishment. She is a thrill seeker. She's a thrill seeker. That's why she's involved in this. I'm just going to throw that in there.
I think that's amazing. Yeah, Brenda, I would love to know, like, as someone that shepherded the sale of one property and now is living in another one, and you're about to break ground on this housing, but all this community stuff is happening. How does that make you feel? Like, what's your experience of it? And also, I want to say to our listeners, because you're a lay leader in the church, you've done this not as clergy, but you've been like a driving force to this project.
So what was your first question?
Yeah, how does it make you feel? Like, as you, like, the journey, like, are you, does it, is it like, oh, it's all been worth it? Or is there still pain attached to leaving the old site? Or, yeah.
So I'll start there with leaving the old site. For me personally, it was not painful. My husband and I got married there, right? We've had a lot of great experiences. But years prior to leaving or deciding to sell the property, Pastor Pat at Zion at our annual meeting had asked us to bring in something that represented church to all of us, right? And so we all got up and brought our one thing and gave a little story about what it was. Mine was knitting needles, right? Church ladies taught me how to knit, and it just, right, felt great. But no one mentioned the building or the stained glass or that, some physical aspect of the building. So that was our kind of our permission to say we can let go of this. And that got us going down the path of looking for someone to buy the property. For my journey in selling the Zion property and then raising my hand to co-lead, so I'm one of two lay people co-leading the effort, was really about finding that one thing that is your purpose, right? We all come to this thinking there's something in it for me, right? There's something, my purpose. And I think that was it for me, is to leave not necessarily my legacy, but my blood, sweat, and tears on the triangle. And it has been a roller coaster. A lot of work, a lot of waking up in the middle of the night going, holy crap, I need to do this, I need to do that. But in the end, it will be so worth it.
Wow. Thank you. Oh my gosh, I feel that. I'm just, like I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Thank you.
And it does take that. Like there's a tenacity and an emotional cost to this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mark, I'm disclosing something here. He's one of our two consultants, and so he's seen our valleys. Right. He knows that we're Staci and I are both very emotional women, right? So when stuff doesn't go our way, it can be trying for us. But we are grateful to have folks like Tyler and Mark on the journey with us, because they can be super creative and persistent. So it's helped a lot.
It is a very up and down thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, one week we're all like celebrating that we're almost there, and another week we're thinking, how can this ever happen? And it literally turns on new information all the time, or new challenges all the time.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you all have been incredibly persistent and willing to just keep moving, because there's just endless things that come up. And there still will be, I'm sure. But today at least, it's looking good, right?
And I have a question. When you guys break ground in July, hopefully, which is what what it's looking at. Okay, July or August. When you break ground, is it breaking ground on the community center and the housing? Like, is it all of it at the same time? It's like a green button. And can you, I'm just someone who's been watching it from afar. How much housing? Do you know how much housing? And do you imagine that the housing is going to be for people already in the neighborhood?
Yeah.
So we're thinking 24 units of housing, so it's small. And we're thinking, kind of the first thought is that we're too small. Our property is too small to do the deepest affordability. They want to be able to do 60 to 100 apartments to do the deepest affordability rentals. But what we found is that really, as Brenda said, there's a lot of this missing middle housing that is just not there in Madison, right? And so that is our focus. We're not, there's no tax base credits that are going into our building project. And so it's small, the housing is small, and it's going to be more of a small campus on our triangle. So the community center will sit separately. It won't be like a ground floor of a building with apartments above. We have single story and, basically little starter homes, World War II starter homes in our neighborhood. So we wanted it to fit in, right? And as well into that. So the apartment buildings will be 2-story, 2.5 story, but not enormous, right? So there was a both and to that in terms of how much we can build and how do we build it. And our team has been really wonderful with all the iterations as we've thought through all of that, what will serve the community best and be a good neighbor in how we construct this. The other thing that I think about the housing that's interesting to me is that one of the things we really felt was needed was that we felt like some bigger apartments were needed for families. We're close to school. We're on bike and bus routes. We're a half a mile away from a grocery store that's walkable, bikeable, and it can take a bus there. So we're building some 3-bedroom apartments, which is pretty much unheard of. They're not all efficiencies, right? So our hope is that for families, that need a place in our neighborhood, that might be an option for them. Our hope is that also some of the folks living independently in their homes that don't want the burden of home ownership as a single older adult might come out, might sell their homes and move in to some of the smaller apartments that we offer to, and not have to leave their neighborhood or their good neighbors.
That's amazing. Yeah, super incredible, actually. And what's the response of the community at the moment, like to the house, to what's, you said like more people are coming in, the church seems to be growing, like you've got kids, not kids before, but just overall, can you talk about, how the community is engaging with the project, the wider project?
So Staci's been at the church for 12 years? 15? So she's been in the neighborhood a very long time. So she's made great connections with not just leadership in the neighborhood, but the neighbors that are contiguous to us. So she's making relationships that are helping this process. But we have been really transparent with the neighbors holistically by inviting them into the I think we were branded the church at the time, a year ago, October, for our first neighborhood community meeting, where we just asked them to put sticky notes on a board to say, what do you want in your community center? We had probably 60 people and a ton of sticky notes on the board, and had conversations with them while they were there, just letting them know that this is what we're thinking of doing, right? Nothing was solid in terms of plans, but we were looking for their feedback. Lots of conversations as things progressed with different folks in the neighborhood. I think Staci reached out to the folks that are right across the street from us. Of the triangle, there's one house on one side, 2 or 3 houses on the short end, and then the school on the other. So we don't have a ton of neighbors right next to us, but Staci's been in conversations with the folks that are in the nearest proximity to the property to get their feedback and their input. That's been very positive. And then just in November, we had our very first official neighborhood meeting with the city, sending out the invitations, the postcards to the entire zip code for where we're at, inviting them to come hear more about the massing study, what our plans were for housing. Obviously, we don't have anything architecturally drawn yet, but it was a chance to, for them to express their concerns. And a majority, having gone through the Zion process, which was all virtual because it was during the time of the pandemic. So all of the city meetings were virtual. But I would say comparing the Zion experience to what we had on November 19th, it was polar opposite. There was a lot of support. There were maybe a couple folks that were concerned about parking, but that's the typical concern that we would hear. So I think that's just proof that the engagement that we've had over 15 years and more intensely probably over the last 3 years is probably going to pay dividends when it comes to when we get to those architectural designs and getting it through the city entitlement process. I think the relationships and the transparency that we've had will pay dividends by making that entitlement process a lot smoother.
That's great.
You've said, you said, your churches aren't very big, right? The two churches that came together, and the Common Grace Combination Church is not huge either, right? And your property isn't huge, and you have some resources, but it's not like you have loads and loads of money in the bank. How have you, as a smaller congregation, done this? I mean, like, this is the kind of question we get all the time. Like, what are the things that made it work to get to where you are thus far?
You forgot old. You forgot old congregation too, right? I mean, right? I mean, so right. I told somebody once that this is like I feel like we're Abraham and Sarah being told we'd have a child in old age, right? I mean, just who would have thought, right? I still shake my head about it. But yeah, I mean, I think what Brenda expressed before so beautifully is that legacy is a huge part of this, right? I mean, I think many small congregations, see what's happening as the vitality and the vibrance of their worshiping communities starts to ebb with a dying population, right? With those beautiful souls that have committed so much of their life and work to the earlier ministry of these congregations. And so I think that people are really committed to the legacy work of this as well as a spiritual practice and as a calling. And I think people have embraced that. I mean, Brenda and I think would both say that we have some exceedingly forward-thinking and self-sacrificing people in these little congregations, and they feel like they've had opportunities to move out of the neighborhoods that we've served on the east side, and they've said, no, this is where we're planted. This is where these are our people, right? And not all of us live in that neighborhood, but this is where we do ministry and the people that we do ministry with. And I think that that's a really powerful piece of it too, right? We've been willing to step out in faith, and the boards have done a ton of good vision work. But I think that legacy of if we aren't here in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, will the legacy of good ministry and community care and a gospel ethic of a self-giving love be part of what we leave in our stead? And I think that is that's been really, that vision has been inspiring to people.
And how have you helped the congregation move through some of this and sort of come to accept the idea of tearing down the building that they're in, or of doing something really different, or changing the whole layout of the triangle? I mean, those are not minor things. And yeah, I'm assuming they didn't all just like automatically say, yeah, let's do it. I mean, how did you help them?
Well, Brenda,
how did you
if I
help
can
them do
just
that?
point back to you and something you said previously. I mean, I have to tell you that I think one of the biggest factors for the congregation I served in the Moravian congregation were the Lutherans that had done that already coming in, right? They said, be not afraid, right? They understood the grief process, and they said, we believe we're doing the right thing, and we still are grieving some things too. They were really honest and vulnerable and open, and that made a huge difference. That's made a huge difference these last 3-4 years. So really, they paved the way.
And for us at Zion, it wasn't about the building, and it basically came down, it was about the people, right? Zion, we could do church anywhere. We did it in our parking lot. We did it at a coffee shop. We didn't, right? As long as we were together, that's what was most important to us as a faith family. And that's a phrase that I think started at Zion, and it's something that we use occasionally at Common Grace, but the faith family, I think by using that terminology, it puts it in more of a relational context versus you're just not a congregation. That's, to me, that says you're just part of the church and not part of a faith community. So again, we may have paved the way for the Moravians because we said it wasn't about the building. And if that helped, happy to pave the path.
And I have to say that we also were in some really great programs. So I'm going to give a shout out to Oikos, Good Futures Accelerator. That was Oikos Accelerator, and a program in our local area called Awaken Dane, which helped us see that other churches were thriving without buildings or without typical building situations, right? I mean, that helped a lot. And we had active cohorts, 5 and 6 people in each of those. And that's a big number for our congregation that were coming back, and they were helping instill that confidence in the rest of the congregation too. So I think those resources that we availed ourselves of and had access to were invaluable. Also, I just have to say, Moravians are good at social revenue, classically, right? Funding the church. So it actually had us go back and look at some history and some theology behind that. So that was an interesting little jog for some Moravians going, oh yeah, Moravians used to do that. Why is that such an unheard of thing anymore, right? So yeah, I'll just throw that plug in there for Moravians. Sorry, Shannon, didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I was going to say, if you're thinking, a lot of the people listening to this program are pastors and church members. And if there's a pastor out there listening to this and to your story, and thinking about what to do with their building, what would you say to them? And I'd love you both to answer that. So Brenda, I'm going to have you go first, and then Staci. And then we're going to move to rapid fire questions and wrap this up. So.
I guess if talking to another pastor, I would say talk to your congregation first. What is it that they see in the future? Because if you don't get the buy-in from them initially, right, you're dead in the water. And then secondly, if they are on board, start an envisioning process. What is it that they see could be impactful? But then go out into the community and find what is God doing out there already. That was part of the Awaken Dane process. So we're not looking to recreate what others are doing, but we're just trying to support that. Because God is out there working already. You just need to be aware and see it versus being internally looking as to what programs can we give. It's really about supporting what's out there already.
That's great. Staci?
I think what Brenda said is, all stuff that I would say to colleagues. But I think, part of what I've offered colleagues is that it's easy to get sucked into seeing this as just a business model, right? And what I try to help people understand is that this is really, I feel, at its core, about learning how to practice resurrection, right? The change, the constant change, the movement towards transformation. I mean, this is literal and physical, but also very spiritual work that we've had to do. And there's a whole bunch of things that I have had to do in the last few years that I never would have imagined would be on my plate. And it's made me lean and trust other people in a different way for leadership. And that's been, I think that's made me a stronger pastor. I know that's made me a stronger pastor. And so, here I'm, 32 years into ministry and doing ministry very differently than I've ever done it before. And thinking this will probably be, how I close ministry with this very vital work that we're doing now. So, you know, it's a commitment. It's a huge commitment, and you're not in it alone. You have to learn how to work with your congregation in a different way, as Brenda was speaking of, and work with development people, and work with city people, and work with your neighbors, right? And so it is challenging, and it's beautiful work, and it's pretty messy, but you know, it feels like some of the most faithful work I've done in my home ministry.
Thank you. I think we're going to skip the rapid fire questions given time, and we're going to ask you a question we're asking everyone. So, and you can both answer. So finally, we are asking all of our guests this season one question. As you consider the reality of the world and the witness of the church in this moment, what is your hope for the church in this moment of change? Brenda, you want to go first?
No. I will.
Sorry.
Okay. It's fine. A loaded question. I think it's not to be afraid of what the future looks like, because it will change. Nothing is going to be constant. And it took our congregation, specifically Historic Zion, a couple of years to read a lot of different books. My husband was on the council, and he'd come home with a new book every couple months. And, you know, because he was reading it, I was kind of hearing about it. And right, it's an evolution. It's not going to be the same. So don't be afraid of that. You know, my hope is that churches will embrace that evolution, and it can lead to something beautiful like we're doing on the Triangle.
That's right. Staci, what about you? What is your hope for the church at large?
I think such a big part of our process, Shannon, has been doing a lot of deep listening and a lot of deep observing of our community, right? In order to reconnect in more meaningful ways. And my hope for the church is that one of our programs was famous for saying, go out and find the good that God is doing in your community and then join it. Don't think you have to bring it. God is working out there, and go find it. Pay attention. And so that's my hope for the church, that we, instead of being feeling the burden of how do we take that or fix that or save the world, understand that the neighborhood could save us, right? If we allow ourselves to understand that God's out there working there as well. So that's been a very hopeful thing for me, and I hope it is for others.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much both for joining us. We're so excited and can't wait to see you break ground. We've been talking about what do we, because as someone that went through Oikos, when you break ground, how do we want to be there with you in spirit at least. Anyway, Mark Elsdon will be there in person.
We would love
that.
Yes, so, we would love that. We would host you all.
So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.